Hello, this is Scott McDonald and welcome to the Perfect Place to Put a Practice video podcast. Today we're going to talk about an extension that I first mentioned in a dental economics article that will be coming out in February of 2018. Now, it's going to deal with cause and effect and correlation when it comes to competition. Now, you probably know that when you order a demographic report or a consultation from Dr. Demographics, we're attempting to look beyond the static numbers to help you see what the most desirable places to practice might be. Now, this is definitely not a one-size-fits-all proposition, not just because that's our sensibility, but because, for practical sakes, you have to make it customized. Now, in fact, that is likely, in fact, to be the most important aspect of demographics, and that's the customization of the information, is certainly the analysis. Now, there's one aspect of our evaluation process that I think will be extremely helpful for you to understand as you look at what has to do with competition analysis. Now listen, every week, without exception, I am asked to help find or evaluate sites that have little competition. Show me where no one else is. Now, the reason's pretty obvious. There is a belief that those locations with few competing practices will have the greatest chance of success for the practice. Now, after all, when there are few dentists, the demand per person will tend to increase, right? Well, I'm not going to say that finding a favorable ratio of population to dentist and dentist to population isn't useful. Still, it is only part of the story and one that is not well understood. And this is what I want to talk to you about in this little video. Now, there is a common error in overemphasizing the competition ratio that may actually hurt your chance of finding a favorable place to practice, and certainly one that is going to be profitable for you. Now, sure, I get it. When you see many other dentists, you can get the feeling as though the location that you're considering is overpopulated with competition. Now, there is no place to put a practice. I hear that all the time, and patients are definitely going to go to the other guy. All right, fine. But please, listen carefully. The truth is that the greatest liability in considering a place with many dentists is not that there is no one to come to the office. Rather, it is a marketing situation where all dental practices seem to meld into a great generic mass. Patients have no way to evaluate you. You see, these practices run together and no longer can be differentiated by a lay person. In other words, when there are many dentists in a small geographic space, there is nothing that distinguishes them unless your messaging is very clear and well defined from their perspective. The solution is not to find a place where there are no other dentists. Rather, it is to create an image or brand that will appeal to the people who want to go to the dentist. This is the heart of market segmentation. You see, without a well-defined brand, there is no reason why a patient will choose any particular office other than based upon their claims about cheap or low-priced dentistry. Other than money, most patients have no way to evaluate the relative virtues of one practice or dentist over another. They have no objective way to do it. In this market situation, the natural tendency, though, is to look for locations where it appears that there are no other dentists. You see, that way, the reasoning goes, patients will have to choose from the few available dental offices in the neighborhood. But here's the truth. The total gross production derived from patients in a crowded marketplace is usually much, much higher in those locations where there are few dentists per capita. You see, there's this idea that a rural area is going to be better because there's less demand. Now, just as a quick example, those parts of the U.S. where there are many dentists are actually, those areas, producing and collecting more than those with few dentists, including rural areas. Now think Scarsdale or Beverly Hills or Seattle, places that are crowded. Now look, I am not suggesting that you pull up stakes and head for a crowded market. But I am trying to suggest that there is more to finding a great place to practice than the competition ratio. Now, nearly all of the listeners to this podcast have some kind of a science background, and they know there is a difference between correlation and cause and effect. You see, a correlation is an important statistical analysis. It suggests that when certain factors are present, a general assumption can be made that will indicate that certain outcomes will tend to occur. It seems logical in considering competition ratios that when there are few dental providers, that there will be a greater demand for services, right? Unfortunately, this correlation may not be caused by the factors that many dentists think. And for this reason, we have to make sure that we are carefully considering all of the factors that play into the outcome that we desire, and not be cornered into somehow believing that the correlation is a cause and effect. Now let me invite you to put on your science hats for just a moment or two and think like a scientist or an analyst. So just stick with me. You see, too often dentists assume that lack of competition is why people are going to the dentist. The opposite may actually be true. In those locations with many dentists and lots of options for practice, in short, lots of competition, there is more dental consumption when there are few than when there are few. Now, people are going to the dentist more often, and they're spending more money in those locations where there are lots of dentists. And that's based upon figures that we've derived from the Department of Consumer Affairs. However, the reason for this likely has nothing to do with the competition ratios per se. It is far more likely that in those places where there is a great deal of competition, there are factors you need to take into account. For example, these people may have a higher education level or a higher earning potential. And you already know this, that people with education and people with money go to the dentist at a higher rate than the poorer and the less educated. It is for this reason that the factor that may be looking for will actually be part of the correlation of a successful practice, in that it has a more favorable demographic character than the number of providers. The number of providers is a correlation, not a cause and effect. And don't get me wrong, there is always a likelihood that a threshold can be passed where the number of potential patients will surpass viability of the available providers. In other words, can an area be too crowded? Yeah, it's possible, but this is not a firm and well-defined threshold. Many dentists have a sense about it. It is true, but I can tell you with confidence, from years of observation, that just because one provider feels that the field is too crowded is not an indication that it is going to be for every other provider. Another dentist will open an office in the same neighborhood, even in the same building, and do remarkably well. Now, I've seen this pattern repeated again and again. It is not the invisible hand of competition that has forced one provider out. It is more likely that the practice model has not been adequately created to serve the potential patient base. That is why I've done so much research on marketing issues and messages, rather than sticking only to the demographic statistics of how many competitors there are in a particular location. You see, you need to know the changing patterns of tide of a potential patient base as it ebbs and flows. Now, as an example, if a population with a distinct culture and language group moves into a neighborhood, the existing practices may suffer because they're not prepared to promote their practices or their offices to the new residents. In short, they're saying a lot of good things, but they may not be saying things that those people want. It's more likely that they're going to struggle, these practices, because they're not accommodating the new residents to the area based upon that population's preferences. This happens as age, income, and education levels change over time, and they do constantly. Some groups are going to be older or younger, have more or less money, or make a different educational attainment level as the past residents. In other words, people change. If you have not gotten a read on the demographics of your area in 5 years, you're very likely going to struggle a little. As an example, there are dental practices in, say, Newton, Massachusetts, and these practices have been around for something like 20 years. The practice owners have an idea of who is living and working in their neighborhood near this town, near Boston, based upon their experiences and observation. Granted, it's valid to a point, but the reality is that nearly the entire area has moved in the last 10 years to be replaced by another population. Or they have experienced demographic changes that have completely altered the demographic character, the wants, hopes, and dreams of that patient base. So let's talk Chelsea for a minute. Chelsea's not the same Chelsea it was 7 years ago. That means that with the population experiencing a great degree of turnover, the practice is confronted with a rapidly changing character. The rate of this change has increased dramatically in that 7 years. Now, this is not unusual, really, especially with an ever-increasing percentage of renters. Now, as I have said before, people are a moving target. The impact upon competition is that in areas like Chelsea, Massachusetts, the established practices are not necessarily going to retain the advantages that they once enjoyed with a long-lived suburban residential character. Factors like gentrification have made this happen. Sometimes areas that were once poor are no longer poor, and vice versa. Now, the point of my little lecture is to beware of the assumption that competition ratios are the do-all and end-all of a desirable area. They're an important aspect, but they're not absolutely important. Promoting the practice to appeal to the largest and or fastest growing subsets of the population and their ever-evolving lifestyles is the way to thrive and to stay ahead of the curve. If you have an idea who you want to serve and that population has moved, frankly, you may need to move with that population. On the other hand, it might be more practical to change the focus of your practice to accommodate to the changing population. In other words, change your messaging, change your offerings, change your marketing mix. In this way, you are correlating the practice to the population most inclined to seek care at your office rather than forcing the office into a cause and effect paradigm that may restrict your chance to grow. This is Scott McDonald at Dr. Demographics. If we can answer your questions, hey, give us a call and we'll be happy to do a report, including telephone consultations. Thanks so much for watching.